And then I'm going to put you guys to sleep. Okay. So the title of my series, as Zora said, is Hidden Waters, Desert Springs, An Uncertain Future. And I did call it Hidden Waters because the water that supports springs is actually hidden underground. Even though springs are everywhere, ubiquitous around the world, I chose the desert because, as you can see in this picture, the contrast between the way spring waters support life and the spare, dry landscape, it stands out really clearly, and that can change preconceptions about the desert being a barren place. I also chose it for the muted colors that can invoke a feeling that springs are in danger of drying up and fading away. For the past 4 years, I've been researching and traveling deserts of the West, looking for arid and semi-arid land springs. This project is part art and part science and intrinsically environmental. I think the foundation for combining art and science actually did come out of my experience as a publication designer at the Museum of Northern Arizona. The map. Hang on.
Yeah, just give it one more second. Sometimes that happens to me as well.
Oh, okay, next. There we go. So this is a map of the deserts in the West. They cover from Southern California on the east side, Nevada, and the Four Corners area, and down into Mexico. And I've been to all except for the Southern Rockies and the Chihuahuan Desert. That would be my next trip, hopefully in spring of this year. We'll see. Ooh. Okay, this is going to be slow. Okay, so oases are often described as islands of water in an ocean of desert. Quito Paquito Springs Oasis is an Organ Pipe National Park. It's a rare example of an intact Sonoran desert ecosystem. And people have lived here for 16,000 to maybe 11,000 years ago. And that makes it one of the oldest inhabited places in North America. Recent construction in the area, however, uses large quantities of water and then threatens the aquifer's future. Springs have been essential to human survival for millennia. Going back as far as 1 to 2 million years ago, early humans were already walking from spring to spring as they migrated out of Africa. Spring-fed oases offer great places to settle, like the town of Jericho in the Judean desert. People were there as early as 10,000 BC, and their descendants are still there today. In our warming modern world, springs have taken on a new relevance. They're like windows into the earth, showing us the health and longevity of their aquifers. This is Quito Vac Oasis, about a half-day's drive south of Quito Paquito in Mexico. They actually share the same aquifer and some of the same endangered species. Although, as you can see, this was once a thriving oasis, and it's been seriously damaged and basically destroyed. When I was there, I spoke with a Tono Otham man from the tribe there, who told me that both oases were stops on their tribe's sacred salt pilgrimage that has been going on for thousands of years. They actually run from somewhere around Phoenix, Arizona, all the way to the Sea of Cortez. And it's amazing because it's men and boys who, they can't take water and they can't take food. They have to just live off the land. It takes about 2 weeks. This project began in a serendipitous way. At a Native American festival in Arizona, I met Navajo members of the Black Mesa Water Coalition. They were describing to me the reservation springs that were drying up. That got me interested. I did some research and found that not many people actually studied springs, and there were no art projects solely devoted to springs. The following week, I was invited to join a spring study field trip on the Navajo reservation. I was awestruck as I listened to the people list how much life actually exists in a spring. Later that day, when driving back through the reservation, looking for springs, I stopped at a house perched on a hill. I was greeted by a furiously barking dog, and I waited in my car till a man came out. I asked him if he knew of a spring I could photograph. He told me his uncle had a spring that his neighbors used until it went dry. As we walked down to this juniper tree, it was hard for me to believe that this very dry spot once had gushing water, but he assured me it really did. He talked about the loss of water and how there was a coal mine that was very close to this area. The mining company drained 3 million gallons of water daily for the last 40 years. It was closed in late 2019, but not before many of the springs were lost. With no running water at home and no local spring, everyone in the area needs to drive to town weekly to get water. Returning to the Sonoran Desert, this is Montezuma's well. Today we know that water coming out of the ground is a result of aquifers or water tables being so full that water emerges onto the land. In the past, people not understanding this thought they were magic and ascribed them mystical explanations. The belief in spiritual power of the water has preoccupied members of every religious faith, and it still does. Healing waters and fountains of youth, even right here in Florida, and I have yet to find one though. Montezuma's well was a sinkhole exposed 11,000 years ago when a limestone mound collapsed, revealing an underground spring that produces 1.5 million gallons of water a day. And it contains the highest number of unique species in any single spring in North America. Historically, this was an important area for indigenous peoples, and it still is today. Several tribe members still consider this sacred waters. Over the life of this project, I've experimented with 3 different ways to create a narrative. I began embedding images into geological survey maps using saturated color and sepia tones to indicate their relationship in time, a past, a present, and a future. I continued with diptychs to extend and enhance the visceral experience of being there, and single images showing the unique character of each spring. Desert springs can be the only water source for hundreds of miles. Another time driving on back roads looking for a spring, I heard this spring before I saw it. The pipe is all that's left of an abandoned trading post on the once popular Mormon honeymoon trail. It took me 3 visits to get this photograph that I was happy with. Talking to some Navajo women who live down the road, they told me that this is the running water for their crops, their sheep, and their drinking water when it was too difficult to drive 20 miles to town. We had a good laugh when they offered to teach me how to tend their sheep. Sometimes humans can have a real impact on a spring, even if we don't have direct contact with it. A friend drove me out to Weimer Springs, deep in the Ponderosa Pine Forest in northern Arizona. I got my shot and returned to the car and decided to get one more photograph when a crack of lightning and a torrential downpour made me rethink that decision. This is an excavated spring, which is not an uncommon sight in the National Forest. Ranchers use it for watering their livestock. I had never seen a red spring before, and I found out the red is because on a practice flyover, they accidentally dumped forest fire retardant out of the plane a little too early. It's never supposed to be dumped near water. The toxicity of these chemicals will take several years to dissipate and will give the cattle and the wildlife more than a bad stomachache. The next spring on the Colorado Plateau, Dow Springs, is a yellow ribbon running through a long, narrow valley of wet meadows. There's evidence of people living here from the prehistoric petroglyphs on canyon walls to the ruins of the early 1900s sawmill and old post office. In 1979, scientists began to take water flow measurements, and it seems to show over time that the water table is decreasing. This is Sebadilla cienega in the Sonoran Desert. A cienega is unique to the Southwest, and it's a freshwater, continually wet meadow. Once common in what is large areas of the Southwest, this is what it looked like before the pioneers arrived. They occupy only 2% of the land, yet they wield a remarkable influence on their surroundings. 19th century European settlers came and they found them a nuisance. 95% of cienegas were drained by the 20th century. Today, they are so rare that they are valued. While people crossing on foot took days to walk from spring to spring, I could drive much of northern Nevada in a day. The first stop on the Old Spanish Trail for me was Warm Springs Oasis, once owned for a short time by Howard Hughes. It's an ecological island in the Mojave Desert, and it supports 28 rare and endangered species. These springs are made of water that's thousands of years old. This fossil water, deep underground, works like petroleum. Once it's been mined, it can't be replaced. This particular oasis has numerous springs that ultimately drain into Lake Mead and then out of Las Vegas faucets. Native Americans believe that the land holds memory, which is true, as many springs contain thousands of years of complex evidence of natural and human events. This is Corn Creek Springs, just west of Las Vegas, home to Native Americans for 5,000 years. It also supports rich diversity of numerous flora and fauna, as well as 450 recorded prehistoric sites. It took just under 100 years for European settlers to almost completely drain the springs by overusing the aquifer. In 1936, Roosevelt's government set aside some land for a national wildlife refuge. That saved the aquifer and the springs. But today it's within the boundaries of the Air Force's Nevada testing site, and they want to use it for bombing practice. When I drove up to Tacoma Hot Springs, it was the colors that made me stop. A few people, looking somewhat gloomy, were staring at the water. They told me the spring contained tiny, biting insects. That would be enough to put me off taking a dip. These hot artesian springs developed a reputation for having healing waters. They're even mentioned in the Prairie Traveler's 1859 handbook for westbound pioneers. And they are still popular with tourists today as healing waters. Salt Creek in Death Valley National Park is one of my favorite photos. This is a spring-fed creek, and it has its own endemic pupfish. They're very tiny, maybe the size of half your finger. Sometime over the last 15,000 years, descendants of the pupfish that were there during the Ice Age, They adapted to extremely hot water in the summer and very cold water in the winter, and 2.5 more times water, 2.5 more times saline than the ocean. There's a large aquifer under Death Valley and a water company that owns land adjacent to it. They want to mine the aquifer and sell all the water to California. They figure the aquifer would be drained in about 50 years. As high as 91% of all California wetlands have been destroyed or drained. Rogers Springs in Ash Meadows, the last intact oasis in Death Valley. We don't think much of rain in the valley because it averages a mere 2¼ inches annually. And when it does rain, and of course that would be the day I came there to photograph, it was pouring. During the 1970s, the spring in Ash Meadows were repurposed for large-scale ranching and agriculture. With so much heavy pumping, they were effectively destroyed. In the 80s, there was even a plan to develop a 34,000-unit subdivision. The Nature Conservancy stopped it by buying the land and donating it for a national wildlife refuge. Since then, the springs have been in the process of being restored. Longstreet Springs is one of the restored springs in Ash Meadows. Scientists are monitoring it to see what happens if they don't interfere with what naturally occurs. However, if the reeds eventually choke out the spring and drive the water back underground, they might make a different decision. The MC in MC Springs stands for the Mojave River's only native fish, the Mojave tui chub. It's related to the carp family. It's another one of those unexpected contrasts, a fish in the desert. This spring is considered a true refugia. A refugia is an area of relative stability where plants and animals can endure despite surrounding climate changes. The fence around the spring, you see, it prevents bighorn sheep from slipping in and drowning, which apparently they did quite often. And then the scientists in the area have to fish the dead sheep out. I guess it's pretty awful. Thousand Palms Oasis in the Coachella Preserve outside of Palm Springs, California, sits right on top of the San Andreas Fault. I walked through the hot desert sands with half a dozen families who came here just to see the pupfish. And you can see them at the bottom of the image here. They're pretty small, right? Like minnows. Arid land springs are distinct from those in more temperate regions because they're typically isolated, making them more susceptible to drought. This tree at Wall Springs is in the Smoke Creek Desert, a minor desert in the Great Basin Desert. It's just such an isolated spring. 13,000 years ago, this area was covered by a vast lake that spread over most of northwestern Nevada. And if you can see this line up here, that was how high the lake was. The owner of this spring believed this cottonwood tree was only planted around the late 1960s. The western cottonwood is a very fast-growing tree. This is the actual spring underneath the tree. It must have been a pool at one time because thousands of settlers walking to California stopped here. The owner told me it looked like this when he got here in the 1970s. It was already almost dry and filled with cattails, and it never changes. Nevada has more hot springs than anywhere else in North America. This is Pinto East Hot Springs. Scientists love these kind of springs with extremely hot, sulfurous, hypersaline water. They're looking for antimicrobial compounds in hopes to develop new medicines. Fly Geyser in the Black Rock Desert is also part of the Great Basin. It sits in a field of warm artesian springs that people have enjoyed for at least 10,000 years. In 1901, farmers drilled irrigation wells, but the water was too hot. 63 years later, an energy company drilled a second hole, and the water was too cold. They failed to seal it. When they did, a geyser was formed. Minerals in the water create this travertine limestone cone, and it will continue to grow indefinitely. The cone was being vandalized, as many springs often are, until an organization purchased it and closed it to the public. I got here on a tour. You can get like one or a couple a week. Bog Hot Springs is located in a very remote section on the Nevada-Oregon border. It's been altered and water mined to serve local ranches. Photographing here at dawn with all that steam made me feel I was standing in the earth in a primordial time. If an aquifer is not too impaired, the springs may be able to be restored. Here we are back in the Mojave Desert, and Shoshone Springs is just such a spring. The Shoshone pupfish was declared extinct in 1970. But years later, biologists were thrilled to find a close subspecies in a water ditch by the side of the road. It was successfully transplanted into this new habitat, and it's become a very popular place for tourists who come to see the fish. While many springs have survived through time, holding their own against natural and human assaults, overdrawn aquifers and the loss of springs has been increasing exponentially since World War II. So many of them are gone that what remains are in peril and endangered. Although Hidden Waters takes place in the desert, right here in Florida, wetland springs and their aquifers have many of the same issues. I hope this shows how springs are a chronicle of our past and a barometer of a potential future and a call to action in the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bremner. This was really interesting, and I really enjoyed this time, and I really enjoy your relationship to water and to the sensitivity that you show when you look for the location, when you scout the location, and also the way you create the pictures. And I do have some questions, but I guess I will leave it first to the audience, and I will invite them. They can either unmute themselves and question directly through Zoom, or if they choose to type question into the chat, I'll be happy to read them and then ask for them. So again, thank you so very much, and I invite the audience to questions. Maybe.
Hi,
yeah,
you can start.
Go ahead.
So this is Sandy. I'm Guinea's husband and Laura's neighbor, Brenda's neighbor.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much for organizing this, and this is a great insight to the work she's been doing. It's super impressive to see the kind of research and effort which has taken It's just enormous. I mean, I'm totally blown away by the quality of the pictures and the
Thank
quality
you.
of the research. And congratulations to such a great work.
Thank you.
And and in fact, I was just passing by, and she said, "Okay, you want to take a look?" I said, like, "Sure." And I was like, "Wow, this is so cool." So amazing job. One question I have is, why did you do this?
Well, that's a good question. I've been very concerned about the environment probably since I was in fourth grade, which is kind of crazy. And I lived out west for a very long time, and people are aware of water and the lack of it and the need for it constantly. As soon as you land in the west, everybody tells you, be sure and have a water bottle, drink a lot of water every day, and it's really easy to get dehydrated. So water is like on your mind all the time. And I like searching for things that people don't pay attention to that actually are really important. I like the unseen, and I like to expose people to things that they think don't mean anything and they don't notice it, but actually it does.
True. Thank you. That's a great. Yeah.
And thank you so very much. We have a question from audience in our chat, and Linda is asking if you consider the project completed or if you are going to continue, and what are your next plans?
I am definitely going to continue. There's the desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, I haven't even stepped foot in, and the Southern Rockies, I haven't seen either. And there's a lot of springs. So the longer I do this, the more springs I hear about. And I will probably go back to each one of the deserts I've been in and shoot a little more. And I'm hoping to go out, I don't know, April, May, June, July, September, and stay out there and photograph as long as I can afford it, basically. Ultimately, I think a book. I'd love to see this in university collections, libraries, and places like that, as well as museums.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's the power of photography, that the message typically, as we know, is more powerful and in photography than in any other possible media. And I believe that it has a big impact in the studies or in the work of other scientists and artists. So yes, I would definitely support you in continuing this project. And you know, I am familiar with the springs, and in Europe they typically are considered as a place of healing. And I wanted to talk to you about that and about the stories that maybe you collected about the healing powers of these springs, because they do have some minerals that we typically do not are able to find anywhere else, or even the air around them is a little different, either the chemistry of the air or the chemistry of the water. Can you share any stories about the healing powers?
Well, not a lot. The Tacopa hot springs that I mentioned, that has, like I said, since like probably the 1700s or earlier, because native cultures considered them healing. They're kind of like muddy, and so a lot of people get in and they have kind of like a mud bath. But as I mentioned, they also have biting insects. So, you know, they're healing, but beware. Um, I haven't actually run into as many healing springs as I thought I would, but I'm not done.
Absolutely, and we have another question from Jan in our chat, and I guess that continues where I end up with the question that I'm familiar with a lot of springs in Europe that have these powers, or there are stories about the healing powers. And Jan is asking if you are planning to extend this project somewhere outside of United States, or what is your traveling plan?
Well, it would be a dream actually to sample springs from every continent on the world. I would love to go into China and see springs there, and all over Europe, and a few in Africa. It's daunting in this age right now, so it's a dream, but I don't know. It's a good question though.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I mean, the United States are offering so many inspiration and possibilities that it will probably be a teamwork to expand this further, right? It's definitely not one-man job, but I applaud you for starting this project. It's beautiful, and the pictures are stunning. And so I also wanted to talk about maybe about the diptychs and how do you approach those. I saw a couple of the diptychs on your website where you work and combine the work in a different context. So maybe you want to tell us about that process?
Well, I found that when I go to a spring, there's springs, as I mentioned, they're very complex places. And I am first attracted to the relationship of the spring to the location. That's my primary way of capturing it. But then sometimes there are details that, just as you might have mentioned, they're kind of poetic and they're more evocative. And I just really hated leaving them out.
Yeah.
And so I thought, what a great way to kind of get far away and then get really close up to it and draw you in as the viewer. I thought that would work.
And it works wonderfully. I was really enjoying your website and seeing all the compositions and context you created. So thank you so much for sharing that. Again, I will want to encourage everybody. See, when we have a artist talking at the museum, then we typically spend several hours, because then we go and see the show and other questions pop up. So maybe this will be a little different, but we will offer to participants, if they have more questions, if they can email us, and we'll be happy to connect with that. But I see that
I have a question from the audience.
Yes.
In person.
Yeah.
She was speaking about someone that she used to know from the Navajo Nation. Actually, there was a lot of stories and accounts of the government kind of dropping more chemicals in these areas, and these people would go to the hospital with kind of mysterious illnesses. So she was wondering if you knew of any other accounts of maybe military dropping some different chemicals on these nations and these people.
Well, I don't really know about sort of planned droppings like you're describing, but I do know that in World War II, particularly on the Navajo Nation, the government came in and encouraged a lot of uranium mining. And when they left the tailings out in the open. They didn't cover them. They didn't try to take them away. And it has been very, very serious in poisoning the people there. And there's been a lot of cancer and a lot of death. And yeah, that's a really bad situation for the Navajo peoples.
We have a question from Jennifer. Has there been interest in this project from indigenous people to raise justice or awareness? I guess that you, being on the spot, you get to talk to them, you get to share the stories. What is their take? What do they have to say, and how they approach it, and how they welcome or maybe try to hide something from you?
That's a good question. I know that I've talked to a man, a Hopi man who's involved with water issues, and he's encouraged me to come out and work with him. I know that he's very interested in anybody that supports water issues. But I also know that springs, especially to the Hopi, but really to many of the tribes, are not only sacred, but they want to keep that secret. And I really understand that. And I haven't wanted to impose or take advantage of that situation. There is somebody who tried to get me a connection, and I think she did, with a tribe in Pyramid Lake in Nevada. And I'm hoping to go back and maybe just talk to them, show them the project. But it's a delicate balance because I really don't want to take advantage, and it could look like that.
Absolutely, they are spiritual places. I mean, water is a source. We can be without food for several weeks, but we really can be without water just for a few days. And so
sure.
there is a lot of I would say secrecy about the water springs and their magic powers, I guess, between indigenous people. So that's why Jennifer was curious, and I'm curious too, how much are they open to share these with the civilization and the real Westerners as we are, right?
Well, I was recently talking to some people about talking to nonprofits who maybe have a relationship already established. And then I'm very taken with the idea of how do people live who have no running water, and would like to maybe talk to them about that and let people know that that is a difficult life for people, and draw attention to it.
Interesting. Well,
I have a question. How many of the springs were on a map somewhere, and how many did you find by word of mouth?
I would say all but about 2 were either on a map or somebody told me to go there. I do drive around a lot, and like the one with the pipe, the very first one, they were accidents. And then sometimes I'll go to an area and then I'll find a spring nearby that I like better. But if they're on private property, I have to get permission of the owner.
Right.
I've heard that. I have a friend who's a biologist, and he studies springs, and he's warned me to be very careful because even the ranchers want to protect their springs. They, that's not spiritual, but that's economic, and it's very important to them. And they don't want people to know where the springs are.
Right. That makes sense.
So, yeah. Good
well,
question.
I guess your next trip has to be with a little private airplane so you can scout. You can scout the springs from the airplane, from the air, and don't have to rely on maps. Well, this was really our pleasure. Thank you so much, Brennan, from coming and treating us to this wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I guess we all now, after we heard you talk and listen to the stories, we'll all probably go back to the exhibition and now see it through a little different frame and have reframed the meaning and the message of this wonderful project. Thank you so much for the work you do. Thank you so much for allowing us to talk to you, and thank you for the exhibition. We are very excited to work with you in the future and wish you best. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting this talk too.
Thank you very much, and hopefully see you soon.
I hope so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bremner.
Bye.
Thank you.